So welcome to today's eco panel. So we've got a great selection of people to talk to. I'm just going to go around and let everyone introduce themselves first. So Max, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, hi, my name is Max Chater. I'm the founder and distiller at Victory London Distillery in E17 in Walthamstow. We produce a range of botanical spirits and sort of pioneers or at the forefront of the chat about sustainability with packaging. Excellent, thank you. And Nolan?
Hi, I'm Nolan Kane. I'm the head of emerging brands at Allied Glass. We are a bottle manufacturer and decorator based in Yorkshire. We've got 2 factories and a full decoration facility. We've been around since the late 1800s, and yearly we make about 550 million bottles, and that varies between, you know, small startups buying, you know, a couple hundred bottles a year to some of the larger brands that buy millions off of us. So we cover a large customer base throughout the UK.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jim?
Hi, I'm Jim Rankin, Commercial Director of Rankin Brothers and Sons. We've been around just a little bit longer than Nolan's company, Allied Glass. We were founded in 1774 up in Scotland, and we have cork forests in Portugal, which we own and manage. And we have manufacturing both in Portugal and in the UK. I'm responsible for all commercial activities, including materials development. So hope to enlighten the panel and the audience with some of the choices that we're having to make.
Excellent, thank you. And Joel?
I'm Joel Harrison, a drinks writer, specialist in spirits. A couple of books behind me, Distilled, World Atlas of Gin, Straight Up. And I also run a consultancy business called Caskstrength Creative that works with brands doing new product development, naming, copywriting, story generation, that sort of stuff.
Fantastic, great. So we've got a great group of people to talk to today, and I'm really, really excited to get stuck into this. So we'll kick off with, Joel, does anyone care?
Sustainability, does anybody care? Good point, especially when it comes to the vessel in which your booze is delivered. But look, sustainability is a massive issue, and it should be a massive issue. I think everybody's got a right to want things to be sustainable. I'm in the process of buying a new car at the moment, and I'm seriously looking at, you know, how can I buy the most sustainable car? Can I move away from petrol to a hybrid or to electric? What's going to best meet my needs? And I think we all need to be talking about it. I recycle diligently. I think the planet that we live on deserves to have us thinking foremost about sustainability. The question is, you know, we care. Is there a wider planet that cares? Are there wider communities that care about it? And if not, how can we make them care? I think number one. If not, question number two, we still need to care if we're the producers and we're creating things to last and be sustainable. 2 gentlemen either side of me on my screen whose businesses have been running for such a long time, and surely you can only keep those businesses going for that length of time if you're sustainable and you're doing things right. And you know, especially, I'm sure Jim will say later on, but you're dealing with trees and cork and, you know, forests, you know, foresting and forestries. It matters that that's sustainable. And when it comes to the production of spirits, obviously that matters when we're growing grapes or we're cutting down trees to make casks. But when we make that spirit and we put it into a bottle, then the wider question starts of what could that bottle look like if it was more sustainable? What's acceptable to put it into? How can we make that look beautiful? And I'm sure Nick will talk about this. How can we make that look beautiful and be beautiful for the consumer? But yeah, absolutely, it should be at the heart of everything we think and talk about, everything we do, and the balance of the way that we live our lives. And if we can do that at the start, that will hopefully end up in the hearts of the consumer at the end.
Great, okay, so why on a sort of a wider thing, like why do we think it's like important? Is it to just sort of, is it we need to save the planet, or is it actually about sort of starting with innovation and that sort of thing? I don't know if anyone's got a view on.
I think the danger is that we all become a bit too prescriptive over sustainability, that we just grab this word that is sustainable and think that, oh, I want a sustainable brand, I want to run a sustainable business, without really knowing too much about what it means to be sustainable. And I think one of the benefits of, if you can call it a benefit, of COVID and the recent lockdowns is that it's given us as an opportunity to think a bit more introspectively, to ask ourselves the big question: what does it mean to us? What does it mean to our business? What does it mean to the consumers of our products and our customers? And the bottom line is that it's a myriad of parts, and we've developed, rather than going down a particular defined route, we've developed a toolkit of parts, really, that where we can, because for us, the first priority must be that the design and the development of our closures, we've got to first ensure fit and function. We've got to be able to provide an efficacious liquid-proof seal so that the contents of, you know, the bottle don't spill in the supply chain. But also we've got to supply, and we've got to be using materials that offers an aesthetic standard, you know, a quality finish that exudes or helps the brand exude its cues to quality, as it were. So does that mean that we choose recyclable products, or does that mean that we choose environmentally friendly or bio-sourced products, biodegradable products? No, it's all about choice, and it's all about asking the question, well, can we go down the recycling route here? And if we can't, then can we be choosing materials, replacing materials, more sort of industrial petrochem materials with those that are bio sourced? So again, it's all about choices, and I know that plastic has been given a bad rap, and quite rightly, recently, and that's caused us to question our use of plastics, because we're plastic molders in the UK. We make many plastic closures. So right now we've developed strategies to really shine a bright light on the materials that we're using at today's date and ask ourselves a simple question: can we replace those materials with other materials that are more environmentally positive? And that's the kind of phrase that we use when we're designing specifications going forward. What can we do to lessen our environmental impact and be more environmentally positive? So I'll throw that back out to you guys, really.
Well, I think Jim, you're right. I don't think that there's a clean-cut answer. I don't think that, you know, everybody can go into a bottle with a high recycled content, or do, you know, go into 100% cork and wood stopper. You know, it's not clean cut like that. I also think that there's a big element of, you know, we need to look at ourselves as individuals and what we expect as consumers, and what we expect and what our customers expect out of us. You know, there isn't just one thing that we can do. You know, if I look at what we're doing as a business, you know, it's not just increasing recycled content in our glass. It's carbon reduction. It's circular economy. It's overall efficiencies. It's pushing our supply chain as much as our customers are pushing us as a supplier to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to improve on what we do. And it's not going to be improved overnight. You know, we've, as a business, have been on a journey over many years, and as you know, as you've pointed out, you know, we've changed a lot as a business over 100 years, and we'll continue doing that. But there's no clean-cut answer for it. The one really interesting thing is that, you know, on people's agenda, sustainability or the environment was very low or not there a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Whereas with all of our customers, it is at the top of their shopping list right now.
It's quite interesting that point. I mean, you know, natural cork for us and for our business has been core to what we do. It's part of our DNA as owners of cork forests out in Portugal. But it didn't matter as much as it now does. 2, maybe 5 years ago, the conversations that we were having with our customers was very different. You know, they were looking at alternatives to natural cork for other reasons, maybe performance issues with clear white spirits and this, that, and the other. You know, synthetic materials came in and they mitigated the risk of discoloration and particulate and other things, other challenges to natural cork. But you know, that argument is swinging back now towards natural cork. People are suddenly realizing that in natural cork they have, or they can make, a sustainable choice.
I think it's really interesting. So obviously, I'm on the other end of it from the production of packaging. You know, I stick liquids in packaging and sell it to the end consumer. I think as the question, as Joel said, like why are people doing it? And if you're starting a brand, we've always been quite eco-conscious, but we're a young brand and we're small. It's a very different thing. You know, we can within a month change our packaging route. We can change how we deliver. We can use zero carbon delivery. We can offset quite easily. I'm not saying offsetting brilliant, but we can, and we can absorb the sort of backlash if we did have discoloration and cork issues, for example, or if people have a consumer issue with with the aesthetic of we've replaced plastic pouches now in the distillery in favor of aluminium cans, but we can navigate that quite easily because of our scale, right? I think if a distillery or a brand is so big, then doing things is obviously going to take a bit of time, and I guess it makes the difference is why are people doing it? If you're doing it so that you can stick a carbon neutral sticker on the back of your bottle, or you're doing it in the same way that people use fair pay as some sort of brand asset, then obviously it's not really the point. But if you're doing it because you do want to continue to grow and to continue to be sustainable as a business, like you two gentlemen have, for a business going for so long, like Joel said, it has to be sustainable in a multitude of ways. And if that's the reason why people are doing it, it's not even necessarily on the brand message. It's just part of what everyone's brand message should be. That's how I view it. But it's certainly easier for people like us than it is for other brands. I can see that.
Yeah, Max, you're absolutely right. And when, as part of the consultancy that I run, we do a lot of new product development for brands, and that could be finding a new product within an existing range of products for a major brand, or it could be starting from the ground and building up. But maybe 8 years ago, sustainability you could have got away with as a lead story. So you were going, well, what's the hook on this one going to be? Well, this is going to be a new expression of, Scotch whiskey X that sells 1 million cases a year anyway. Well, let's do a sustainable version of it, and that's your NPD. Nowadays, it's a core value across the entire range, and it's almost a given. You have to weave it into your story. And I think even that shows the great kind of leaps and bounds and strides that the industry is making, just to put that in place as a core value, as opposed to making it a lead story. And you're absolutely right. I think that for me shows how progressive I think the drinks industry is when it thinks about nose to tail sustainability. And it's just good to know that that's being held up as a core value, not a value for promotion or building a story on.
I think that's a really interesting point. And if we think about, my team's probably dealing with about 8 distilleries that are being built right now, and all of them, sustainability is a key point to everything they're doing. And it's not, as you say, it's not something that they're doing it so they can put it on a label. It is something that is essential. I'm not a distiller, but I do know that it's very energy intensive, as glassmaking is, to make a liquid. And it's great that it is now in the DNA of the industry that if you are setting up, this is the path that you need to go down.
I think it's a very interesting point that, Max, you brought up, that because of your scale and because of your size, you can act quickly. You can be really dynamic in your change, as it were, and you can affect that change very quickly. For a lot of the, I would say that the brands that are owned by the big multi-international groups, it's harder for them. It's really hard because there's a lot of stuff connected to that brand, a lot of intellectual property, a lot of history, a lot of provenance that goes into that brand. And as a consequence of all of that, they're very protective of those brands. So change happens more slowly. But what is interesting and what we've seen as a business is that push and pull kind of effect. So lots of smaller owner managed businesses have come onto particularly the craft distilling scene over the last 5 or 6 years. And they're the agents of change. They're the ones that are reaching out, are able to make these choices, make the change within their own businesses, grab a sustainable future, as it were, and they're putting pressure on the large multi-international brand owners to follow that change process as well. So it's quite an interesting dynamic. Takes a long time for the really big boys and girls to make that change. But, you know, again, it's all about the pressure that's been exerted on them in their own space by the smaller owner-managed businesses.
I think there's often an issue as well with the sense of a proprietary idea or concept and brand ownership of it. So if, for example, I mean, we released cans, you know, as a replacement to our refill at home system, and for trade we do kegs and steel kegs and aluminium cans, and instantly the next couple of days other distilleries and brands were messaging me personally saying, where do you get your cans, how do you seal your cans, and it's really important that we say, well, we do this, we do this, we do this. And I think what happens with big brands, first of all, they've got the money, so they absolutely, well, some have the money where they absolutely can change, albeit slowly, but they can excel where we can't, in the fact that an idea, not that I'm saying I own cans, but, you know, an idea can be built upon and improved vastly with a decent amount of cash. But it's important for people who have the ideas not to just hold it all back, like, you know, sustainable forestry or whatever else. It needs to be shared. The information needs to be shared so that everyone can benefit. And that's what I was saying about, are you doing it for your brand message and for your Instagram account, or are you doing it because you believe in what you're doing? And if you believe in it, you'd share it, because
yeah. And I think there was a time, what, 10, 15 years ago, when there's probably a term for it, I'm going to make one up, which I would call kind of apologetic spending, where you would go, oh, do you know what, we're manufacturing this and flying it all around the world, so we'll plant 1,000 trees and that'll offset it. And you're like, okay, cool. That's one way of targeting sustainability, but it's the seismic change of people actually doing things differently that has really developed over the last decade. And it's not just like, on the one hand, we're going to do something bad, but we'll just pay to offset it with something good. You know, a right, cancelling out a wrong. Now it's about just getting it right in the foundations. And exactly what Jim said is, you know, a lot of these brands, especially the high volume, lower value brands, have very sensitive price points across their manufacturing base. And, you know, one slight tweak on the bottle cost or the cost of the capsule or whatever it might be, or the cardboard box it comes in, can have a knock-on effect to the overall sort of GP of the brand. And then that can upset the balance of that on the shelf in a very competitive market space. And that's, you know, something you really have to think about if you're going to weave sustainability into the integral element of your brand and build it into the price point. But again, what Max is saying about moving towards cans or tins rather than pouches is brilliant. And I was reading a piece in the magazine to the Worshipful Company of Distillers, and Garvin Brown was interviewed in that, and he was saying that there's actually a global shortage at the moment of aluminium, because so many people, obviously there's a popularity, a rise in hard seltzers and a rise in wine and cans and everything else, but this idea that people are embracing the sustainability of the can, and it's causing a shortage of aluminium, which in one way is really good, because it means that people are embracing sustainable materials, which is great.
I think aluminium is a funny one at the moment. I think it's like 80% of the world's aluminium has been in circulation for ever. You know, it's like for since it's been produced. You know, it's like 80%. It's still being produced, obviously, but it's just like the data on it's crazy. And glass is obviously fantastic recyclable and everything as well. And we wouldn't ever want to replace our glass bottle. Like, that's not the point for what we're doing. But aluminium is infinitely recyclable, and it's the problem is the end consumer's perception of quality, which I know is something else we're going to talk about, and obviously Allied will have a massive opinion on that and know firsthand. It's the same as closures and everything else, but what people get in their hands, the end consumer, is a little bit like, for a long time we've been resting upon the idea that recycling is really up to the person who buys it. I mean, it's not my fault. It's a little bit like offsetting with tree planting. You know, well, yes, I put it in this thing that's non-recyclable unless you remove this part and this part and this part and take that bit off, and that bit goes in that bin and all of that. But that's really the consumer's problem. I mean, that can't be the case anymore, right? I mean, it needs to be easy, and that's governmental. You know, that's the bin collections and everything else. But on this end, but certainly, an aluminium can of gin, you know, that's not, no one's going to put that on their shelf at home like you have behind you, some of you, as an aesthetic piece. I mean, it's cool, but it's not that. So you still need this, right? You know, and that's really the thing. And large brands are going to find that infinitely difficult.
I think the interesting thing with that though, Max, and you're absolutely right, but kind of on Joel's point as well, is that if you look at the bigger guys, and I get that, you know, it takes much longer to make an elephant dance than you know, a small person, but the thing is with it is that a lot of the big guys naturally through cost savings are actually quite sustainable. So their containers are much lighter. You know, a lot of them are using ROPP closures, which are easier to recycle within the system, you know. But I think there's also an element to this, is that, you know, back to the original question, is that do people care? And I really think that there is a big piece that needs to be done around how can we be better? So Max, you're absolutely right. You know, recycling aluminum cans. Sorry, I'm Canadian. That's what I call it. Recycling cans is easy for people to do. But if you look around the UK, for instance, there are still councils. I live in Leeds, and you can't put bottles into your bins. You have to take them to a recycling center.
Yeah. And contamination is obviously a massive factor.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There's a big conversation right now in the on-trade about how much glass actually doesn't get recycled.
Yeah.
You know, these are big problems that we need to approach. Like aluminum, you know, glass is infinitely recycled as long as you recycle it, you know. And if you put it in landfill, just like a can, it is going to take, you know, a millennia to essentially break down. So it's also doing that piece. And how can we as manufacturers, how can brand owners, and how can consumers be better at actually approaching this problem? Because I think that, you know, some countries are better than others at doing it. And unfortunately within the UK, you know, we're not the worst, but we're definitely not the best.
Nolan, you make a really great point. When you talk about the idea of different countries, you know, having different approaches, and I visit my family. I have a family in Norway a lot, and quite a lot of family in Norway. And you'll be at the end of a can of beer or something, and you'll go to crush it up, and they'll be like, "No, stop! You know, we get money back for that. The bottles will get recycled properly." And there are just systems in place that yes, we are lacking. I think we're all sort of UK based. We're lacking over here, and I really wish we had those, because it would, again, not just have the manufacturer talking about sustainability, but it would have the end user talking about sustainability. And when you're hearing it from both sides, you're more likely to be engaged in it. And I think that's it's a sad state of affairs in our country, I think, where that we're being told by the manufacturer really that to be more sustainable, and it kind of, that conversation is led by the manufacturer, which it should be being led by the manufacturer and kind of by a wider governmental thing at the end of it, but that's a very market specific thing.
I think it's
you're
interesting,
right, Joel. You know, it's all about having that joined up connectiveness, because Nolan's business and our business, ultimately legislation is a huge driver of change. We've got a whole raft of legislation and requirements with regard to plastics use as manufacturers to contend with over the next 2-3 years. But that's all very well and good, that legislation coming down the track, and we're aware of it, and we're trying to make sure that we're well and truly ahead of it. But if the government haven't helped put in place logistics change and recycling operations, then it all kind of falls fallow, really, doesn't it? So it's all about having that holistic approach to it. Yes, force change on the manufacturers, but goodness me, put in place something that enables the collection and the recycling to happen.
Jim, can I ask you a quick question on non-refillable closures that go onto bottles? Obviously, they're plastic. All the ones I've seen are plastic with a little ball, metal ball in it. How does that change the kind of efficacy of recyclability of a glass bottle?
Well, I'll tell you right now, we don't manufacture and supply non-refillable closures, okay. But it's a component part. It's a modular closure, so it comprises an aluminium shell, a glass ball, and plastic moldings. And that's not easy when it gets in the recycling chain, as it were. It's not easy to break up, nor are there systems in place to break up those component parts and to separate those materials. So again, it's not my area of expertise, but that's a complex closure. in terms of its ability to be recycled, and for those materials to be stripped.
I guess it would depend on where it's being recycled as well, as to what equipment's in place and if it's going to be incinerated, scrubbed, separated manually, or whatever else is going to happen to it. So it's like you were saying before, is, you know, UK is not necessarily the worst, but not necessarily one of the best. There's no returnable element. We wanted to do refills at the distillery from when we started, where people would walk in the door and we would refill it, or especially bars, and we would give a retro back on returned bottles, but it's legally not. You're not really allowed to do it with food with food vessels in the UK. You can't really use them, even to craft breweries. Sorry, I just pointed over there because there's one there. And even with breweries, returnable glass in Germany and everywhere else, Coca-Cola bottles and all this sort of stuff. So exactly as you're saying, that the legislation is all very well and good, but it needs to be supported by the government, right?
That's an interesting point, that, Max, because I've got a local craft brewery, the Windsor and Eton Brewery, and I bought a growler from them. And I take that down there and they fill that up. And it's brilliant because it's supporting a local business, which, you know, tick. The quality of the product's brilliant, tick. And it's reusable. My reusable growler it will get a lot of use this summer if the weather was like it was last summer. And I think if that can be sorted out, again, you can support local businesses and you can refill, and that can be built into legislation in a proper way. That's a really lovely way forward for sustainability, just because it's so simple.
Well, it's interesting as well to talk about. Well, I know we're going to talk about sort of we're talking about, do people care? And I think a growler is, as an aesthetic, is an immediately obvious thing. It's probably got a swing top or a screw cap, and it is as intended. And the problem we have with spirits is, obviously, as you'll know, brands spend a lot of money on making their object that the liquid goes into to be desirable. And some of the key points about sustainability that you just mentioned, about, you know, rock tops or whatever, they're not seen as premium, and so they're not seen as something that's desirable. And also, if you are going to do a refill concept, as we're rebranding at the moment, and if we need to make our bottle sustainable and recyclable, but also permanent, because the whole point is that we offer refills. And so it's another layer of, we want someone to put that bottle at home and not necessarily just put fairy lights in it and a flower. That's all very well and good, but we don't want to just screen print it blue, right? So, like, what will we do so that it's permanent, so that someone buys a refill and keeps on doing it? And with a growler, it's quite obvious. It doesn't need to be pretty. It doesn't even have to be a specific weight of white flint. It doesn't have to be a certain type of vessel. It can just be anything, because it's just like a milk bottle, right? I mean, it's endlessly used, right? But it's really tricky, because I think if you went down to a 400 or 500 gram bottle for glass with a rock top, people would throw it away because because of how we treat objects, you know. And that, I don't know what's the industry standard, Nolan, for glass weight at the moment, because it's brought down a lot by big boys, right? But I mean,
yeah, it is. So you know, as you've touched on, Max, you've got the super lightweight stuff that is your own brand vodkas that you see in Co-op and the likes of that, and those are very light bottles. But you know, glass is pretty strong. What I would say is that, you know, as you guys are all aware, the real trend within, you know, the emerging brands craft channel, especially over the last 10 years, was buying off the shelf standard with a really thick base, because the thick base was essentially premium, or that's what everybody thought.
Yeah.
And the trend that we've seen is that that's completely gone out the window. So, you know, don't get me wrong, when you get to your whiskeys and you get to your rums that you know are aged and they have the real kind of premium aspect, then yeah, thick base 100%. But you know, most of the people that we've converted either from standards or also in a proprietary bottle to another proprietary bottle have lost that thick base. And you know what, you know, you can still have a beautiful bottle. A great example of that is the new Masons of Yorkshire bottle. You know, that bottle, we took 250 grams out of the bottle. And you know, a little kind of unknown fact is that actually when you've got a thick base bottle and you've got a complex bottle that you need to move the glass around, it's a bit trickier because you've got a lot of glass that you've got to control. If you're taking out weight, you can do more interesting things with the glass, to a certain point, because you still need strength to the glass. But you know, the Mason's bottle is a really good example of it. Another good example of you know, where you've been able to take out some weight. So I'm just looking at my booze cabinet that's literally directly across me. But you know, there's some people that have done some interesting things around that. 58 Distillery down in London have done something similar, that they've got a really nice looking bottle that isn't heavy now. And that's also made in standard flint instead of premium. So they've got a higher recycled content in it. You know, there's a lot of people thinking about a lot of stuff, but the heavy, thick base bottle is definitely a thing of the past. And then if you look at all the major brands, I mean, you know, unless you get to a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue, all the Johnny Walkers below that are in very, very light bottles, but they still have a premium feel, a premium aspect. You know, things like Hendrick's Gin are in a fairly light bottle. You know, there is, you know, I think there's a certain element to it that, you know, for instance, Max, you know, your branding's always been great. And if you get your branding right, people, you know, this whole thing of people thinking that you need a heavy bottle and that feels premium. People, listen, we're in the time of Instagram and TikTok and things like that. You know, people buy with their eyes, and they're more interested in showing something interesting. Nobody ever sits there on Instagram and goes, look at how thick the base on this bottle is. It must be really fancy. You know, they want, you know, a bottle that looks really interesting and beautiful and stands out on shelf. And essentially, if you look at a lot of brands that have gone, you know, have executed some really well bottled, you know, well-designed bottles over the last couple of years, it's done massive advantages to their brands. So it's more about the look and less about the weight these days.
Do you think that those brands that you mentioned there were doing it out of eco sensibilities, or if it was just because the less glass they use, the cheaper the glass is to manufacture?
I think that's an interesting question. I would probably.
I was being sincere, by the way. I wasn't.
No.
I just wondered.
Listen, at the end of the day, when you're growing your brand, as you know, Max, you know, every little bit helps, and your margin is key, really key. And you know, you are going to save some money. But what I would say is that what's taken out of the conversation is that weight is premium. So you know, they are getting some cost savings in the bottle. But people no longer are saying or are saying as often in conversations, well, if I lose weight, my package or my brand won't be as premium as it should be.
It's funny. I'm part of a WhatsApp group of brand owners, mainly in spirits, but in all soft drinks and all sorts of stuff. And there's lots of conversation about all of this always. And there's someone came on and was boasting about their bottle weighing, you know, 1.8 kilos or something unfilled, and everyone was just, what are you doing? Like, you're sending a case that's 12 kilos before you put liquid in it. Like, it's just madness.
Yeah. And this is the thing though, Max, as you know, and this is one of the things that the big guys obviously have realized over time, is that it's not just your unit cost that you're paying for. It is the weight that box costs to ship. And then when you get to a point that you're shipping to another market in you know, when you're doing pallets, if your bottle is too heavy, you're going to have to take a layer off that pallet.
And from a sustainability angle, for the eco aspect of the conversation, of course, the lighter the box, the less, you know, and the smaller as well, right? I mean, surely the smaller we get, the more we get in a van or on a ship or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
So there's a lot of changes that people are making, and sustainability is a big push, but you know, from at least from a glass side of things and looking at what the bigger guys do, is that, you know, they are being very boisterous, rightfully so, that, you know, hey, we've taken this weight out of this bottle, but you know, at the end of the day, there is some cost savings when you're taking glass out as well. So
I think it's also important to raise this challenge, and you mentioned it, Nolan. Every little helps, of course, doesn't it? And it might seem glaringly obvious to all the folk gathered around this call, but to be more sustainable means to be less wasteful. And it's quite interesting that for the last 10, 15 years, the brands have challenged us on particular things like aesthetic defects or quality control. So I don't want to speak for you, Nolan, but it's a good example. The glass industry accumulates not a significant amount of in-process waste, because it's looking at for aesthetic sort of defects in the glass, not functional defects. The glass container is perfectly okay, but inclusions and all sorts of other sort of aesthetic defects. Now, if the brand teams were just a bit more relaxed about these kind of defects, we would be less wasteful. And Nolan and his colleagues in the glass manufacturing business would be able to get greater efficiencies and that accumulate less waste. And some of the products that we manufacture in terms of our wood top stoppers or molded top stoppers, if there was a greater tolerance for some of the more, how can I put it, acceptable aesthetic defects, then of course that's got a benefit, because we've accumulated less waste, we've become much more efficient.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, and I think there's also other elements, and it brings back to the overall piece of what you're doing, at least for us as a manufacturer. The hurdle that a lot of manufacturers have, for instance, that make color glass, is that as Jim says, that your efficiencies can be really low if it's a super premium bottle, and that glass isn't leaving your factory. Now, if it's a color bottle, a lot of manufacturers don't have the capability to recycle that glass. So that is going to a landfill or a local recycling company, and it could end up in a road, because a lot of old glass ends up in roads. Yeah. So I think, I think it's also understanding where your packaging is coming from, and what they do with things like, Jim points out rejects. Us as a business have spent a lot of time and a lot of money figuring out what we can do with that glass, and we're now putting it 100% in the system. Great result for us, but and we can happily share that with our customers. But I think the thing is that more of us need to be asking the questions of what the overall piece does, because there's a lot of elements, and Jim, you're absolutely right. I mean, the waste that will happen to get to that perfect package can be really high on some projects. The reject levels that we have on super premium whiskey are through the roof. Now, all that glass gets recycled and it's fine, but on Jim's point, there's some stuff that won't be able to be recycled. So how do we get that happy medium, and how do we find solutions to do something with the stuff that actually doesn't get to market?
Well, the pre-recycling, the energy of producing all of that waste has to be accounted, as well as the actual package. I mean, you've put in a lot of emotional energy, but also physical energy to produce those things. And if they're rejected because of minor defects, then that energy, well, even more energy has to be used even to recycle it, right? I mean,
yeah, 100%. And I think that the one thing that brands are starting to warm to is the hunger from consumers. We run three kinds of glass: color glass, standard flint, and premium flint. Standard flint has recycled content in it. Premium flint is 100% raw materials. So Max, on your point, we're essentially melting sand. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever tried to melt sand, but it takes a lot of energy, so it's one of those things. Now, when we melt it, we can recycle it, we can recycle it. A lot of brands absolutely refuse to go into premium or into standard flint. It wasn't good for their brand, whereas that mentality is massively changed. But also with that, there's brands that need to be in and should be in premium flint, but there's also, you need to understand your supply chain, because there is stuff that you can buy locally for not only just glass, but all sorts of stuff that is coming from the other side of the world. And I think you need to ask the question of, if you sat down with your consumer and you said, I can buy this locally, or I can buy this from South America, what would you rather me do? But the one locally maybe will be a little bit different. I'd probably argue in most occasions they preferring that you're buying it locally or being as sustainable as possible.
I think there's a big problem. One of the problems there is that local production tends to be more expensive, and it's something that we've run into with our current rebrand. We would love to use mostly recycled material. I'd love to say to you, everything that you're about to throw away, you can make my bottle out of. And I'd love to buy it from you up the road. But also I could have that conversation, and like you say, I can have that conversation with someone in Asia, and they'll say, well, the price of it is, the minimum order quantity is halved and the price is halved. And you're like, it's a really difficult thing as a brand to go, oh my God, are we going to pass that on to the consumer? Am I going to buy a bottle that's double the price, but then I have to add on my 4 or 5 times of that cost for my profit margin and my staff? Or am I going to get it from the other side of the planet where it's a lot cheaper, but yes, I do have to go and plant 1,000 trees, as you said.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think it's easy for you to sit there, or sorry, for me to sit here and say you should be getting it locally. I think, there's a lot, it's also about the longevity and the survival of your brand. And there is it brings back to the margins. I mean, like Rosie, from your side, are you getting a lot of feedback from consumers? I mean, do you guys get pushback on things like this, or is it kind of something that you are working towards as a business, but actually from a consumer end, you don't get as much pushback?
Yeah, I mean, probably from our side, I would say it's much more push from the business as opposed to pull from the consumers. It's still something they're all really, really interested in, but I don't think it would stop anyone purchasing based on that. It's something which we're working really hard on in the background across the whole business, not just in product development, but actually in across using our hauliers and making sure we're using people that are doing the really hard work, and they're sharing that back with us and saying, okay, by using us, you've done the equivalent of planting 500 trees this year. So doing, as we've sort of discussed, I mean, it's looking at the whole sort of holistic picture from sort of right at the beginning, before you've even made a product, through to where is it going, where is it ending up from the consumer, but then also into the recycling, or is it being reused, or is it closed loop? So yeah, it's definitely more of a sort of a push from business as opposed to a pull from the consumer. But I think it's really important in this to just be ahead of the curve. You don't want to be working on something after someone's asked for it.
Yeah, great point. Yeah.
But I think that pulls us quite nicely onto sort of like end of life recycling. So I've done quite a lot of research in terms of, obviously we know in the UK so many different councils, so many different ways of doing things. I live in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. We've only, as of last year, we were allowed to put our glass in the recycling. So things are changing and they're keeping up. But also I think responsibility, sort of accountability, whose responsibility is it to make sure that it's that? And I think, as we mentioned before, the onus on it being the consumer is definitely wrong-minded. It shouldn't be their responsibility. We should provide them with a product which is easy for them to do the right thing with when it's finished. So I mean, there's all sorts of things like percentage of contaminants when it goes through the recycling. How do you make sure your product goes through there? I mean, I've looked at various things where actually there's a person standing there picking things out if they don't think it looks like that. So you're trusting a person to say, okay, that bottle looks like glass. So there's so many different ways of doing things. There's no clear-cut straight answer on how do I make sure as a producer and manufacturer I'm doing the right thing. There's no sort of black and white answer, which it's interesting, but it also shows I think there's a lot more work to do in terms of education and infrastructure as well, which is quite interesting. But so end of life and recycling, reusing versus recycling, closed loop. I mean, looking at things like foil on labels and other contaminants, maybe like rubber stamps and that sort of thing. Where do we think that sort of goes in terms of, you know, how much does that really complicate things and actually make something less sustainable?
Well, I'd go back to my original point, and as a producer and as a manufacturer of closures, we've got to, first and foremost, we've got to make sure that we support the brand with an efficacious liquid-proof seal or with a tamper-evident closure. And there are a great many materials that we'd love to be able to use that would smash and grab at today's date, but they can't produce us the product that we need that will support optimal performance. And I think, yeah, absolutely right. It's all about having that helicopter view and understanding what our impacts are and what the brand users or the bottlers' impacts are, and then the consumers, and having an honest conversation, having that conversation that says, look, right now, we can't move this particular material into a more environmentally positive space, but we're working on it. Or the conversation could be, we can't use a recyclable material, but we're running trials as we currently are. We're running a dizzy matrix of trials right now that incorporates all sorts of materials. Again, biosourced materials, biodegradable materials, and recycled materials, and even ocean waste. So we're looking at a whole busy book of materials so that we can test those materials, so that we can find out whether or not we can move the particular product that material supports into a more environmentally positive space. If we look at things like neck wraps and seals, particularly heat shrinks, one of the big wins right now is that our customers were using an awful lot of PVC, heat shrink materials. Great for tamper evidence, fantastic substrate to print on. So we were getting all those, funky aesthetic details and cues to quality and this, that, and the other. But with PVC, we can move to PET. Now, it's still not the best material in terms of environmental credentials, but it is better than. So I think what we're going to see over the next 5 years, particularly from the manufacturing base, is incremental change. And that change will be driven by innovation. It'll be driven by customer push, which is right and important. It'll be driven by consumers and consumer self-interested parties and groups as well. But it will also be driven by changes in regulations and legislation. So we've got this huge dynamic going on, but I wish we could have a box of silver bullets delivered on Monday, but it doesn't work like that. There has to be the motivation to want to make the change in the first place. There has to be the push to keep you honest and keep you true. But also we have to be honest about and feed back to both the consumers and the users exactly where we are in the process.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I know from buyers as well are getting to the point where they may start saying soon, actually, we're not going to buy that if it's not sustainable, or if this uses a lot of plastic, it's not something we can justify selling. So I think actually we might see more of that stuff happening as time goes on as well, where actually you won't be able to get your product listed anywhere if you're not doing your due diligence and the right thing in terms of sustainability.
Yeah, I think there's a big question is getting the consumer to ask those questions in the first place, like Jim has said. I'm very privileged tomorrow to be going for my first vaccine. The last question I'm going to ask is the glass bottle it comes in sustainable and recyclable? I don't care. I just want my vaccine, right? And I think this is the point where when you're coming into the world of luxury, and consuming spirits should be considered a luxury, and it should be something we do in a considered space and we do sensibly, then we are right to be saying we need to be asking these questions. But as Jim points out, you're dealing with spirits, and spirits are pretty nasty products to put in any packaging type because they demand a certain robustness from packaging. And therefore, the first piece of diligence that we have to have is as Jim has said all along, and Nolan too, is to the spirit quality. We want the spirit quality to remain brilliant all the way through. And where we talk about sustainability, we have to also hand in hand talk about spirit quality and maintaining the spirit quality to the consumer, because that is the single-handedly the most important thing. Because if that degrades, the industry will degrade, and we won't have an industry to want to have a conversation about being sustainable about in the first place.
I think the interesting thing around that as well is that there's been some really great announcements over the last 12 months around some alternatives for packaging, but there is a place for everything. I think the innovation of having a bottle that's made from recycled paper is fantastic, but I really can't fathom that someone is going to try to sell a 40,000 pound bottle of Macallan in a paper bottle. I think there's a place, and I think that, credit to Max, because Max was one of the first people in the UK to do it, but not sit there and say, I'm not using glass, or I'm not using this, but I'm going to have this and I'm going to have that. And I think that the trend that we are really seeing with people is that, and what I will hope keeps on evolving, is that, there isn't going to be a single use for a brand. There's going to be multiple things, and there is a right place, right time. As Max says, you want a beautiful bottle. A brand needs a bottle on a bar, to stand out, and a brand needs, a bottle on shelf in a supermarket to stand out if they want to fetch a certain price for it. That's the reality. It brings back to us buying with our eyes. But when you have that bottle, is it possible to have a refillable pouch or a can, or there's There's some innovation that I believe Mangrove brands are bringing over to the UK, which is essentially a refillable large glass jug. That's come from a couple markets in the Australasia region. So, you know, things are going to keep on evolving 100%, because there is just not one answer. And let's be brutally honest, there's some pretty reckless stuff out there when it comes to packaging.
And it's about finding that balance between those interesting refillable options and you know, fraudulent activity within the marketplace. And you don't want, you know, nobody wants their bottles of a £50 vodka to be filled with the liquid from a £15 vodka, and that's very easy, I'm sure, to sell to people in nightclubs after, you know, 2-3 o'clock in the morning when they've had enough of the £50 vodka to not be able to tell about the £15 vodka. And I'm sure that
that doesn't already happen.
Well, exactly. So you know, I think all of these things are great. From a home consumer, one of the things that's really important to me, and it's literally one in 1,000 this happens, but it is the bottle I don't want to throw away, the bottle that I don't even want to refill. I've got a couple of examples. Here's an Isle of Harris gin bottle that I bought up in Isle of Harris. That is just beautiful, and that sits on my shelf at home. That will never be thrown away. You know, it will be reused, repurposed into olive oil or water for dinner or something like that. That is ultimate, for me, the ultimate sustainability. I'm not just buying a vessel to hold the liquid for however long it takes me to drink it. I'm buying a vessel. I'm buying an objet d'art. Here's another one, is a pink pepper gin, Odamus Spirits, a bottle that I have. And I've actually refilled with pink pepper gin in the past. I've got a tequila bottle upstairs, which is sort of dotted by Mexicans and with a little kind of bejeweled sort of local artwork, and I refill that with the same tequila it had in it. So these for me, that's true sustainability. It's like that, take away the burden of having to even throw it away from me. You know, give me just something that's absolutely beautiful that I want to keep, that I want to use, and that fits with my lifestyle to do so.
But I think that's a challenge with a lot of brand owners, is to do that. You know, I remember talking to Seb Healy from Manchester Gin when we first started talking about doing his bottle, and he said, "Listen, Nolan, I want a water bottle," and I was just like, "You making water now? I don't get it." And his whole theory is that he wanted every bar in Manchester, when you ask for some table water, to be in one of his old gin bottles. And I'd probably argue that they've got to a pretty good place with that design. But I think because they had that kind of that future sight of what they wanted to be and where they want it to be, they took a little bit more time to do it. And also, you know, the two examples that you've just shown there, Joel, you know, they were released as special editions, and you know, hopefully that people will reuse them. And I mean, the interesting thing about those bottles is that I think they're both really beautiful bottles, but the scary thing on the other side of that, though, is that, you know, terracotta you can't recycle. So if you put it in the system, it's going to create, you know, coming from a glass maker, it's going to create chaos if someone tries to get some of that in our bottle, because you can't melt it down. So, you know, I think the thing is as well is it almost breaks back to that education piece. It's like, you know, if you're doing something like that, you really need to push on. You need to reuse this, but you need to reuse this because actually you can't recycle this. You know, that I think there's an element that you know, brands could actually push it a bit further, and they could educate their consumers as well.
I agree. Would you want it to be the bottles that you just showed us there? Fantastic examples, and they are subtly branded. You know, they are, but they're subtly branded compared to their standard bottles. Do you think that's partly the reason why you've kept them? Do you want them to be a bit unlabelled for olive oil, water, and so on and so forth, or is it just the aesthetic of the material? And then I can only speak from my perspective, but with our new bottle that we're hoping to develop, we've toyed with the idea of, is everything about our brand removable? Is everything about it removable for recyclability? So we've got a post-consumer waste label on there with an adhesive that's biodegradable and all that sort of stuff, great. But it can just be peeled off and it no longer says Victory on it, and it's just a beautiful decanter or bars or olive bottle or whatever. Or do we want our brand still in there because we want the water bottle in the bars? And I guess that's a little bit like I was saying earlier, are you doing this for your brand or are you doing this for the good of doing it? And it's, for me, I want victory written on it because I'm like, you know, I like that's who we are. And I want someone to pick it up in your house when you're pouring olive oil at your, you know, on your bread or whatever, and go, oh, that's really nice. Oh, it's a gin company. I'll buy one of them.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I actually have an olive oil bottle or a bottle with olive oil in it downstairs. It's an old Ardbeg bottle, green glass. You know, and it's got an embossed A at the top, and it probably says Ardbeg on it somewhere. But I've used it for a decade, and it's just become the olive oil bottle, you know, and it fits in really nicely. But yeah, you know, aesthetics is a huge part of it. This Harris Gin one, the labels come off, and it doesn't even say Harris Gin underneath, so that will get used, but nobody will know it's a Harris Gin bottle unless they see it next to the taller version and everything else. But maybe it will come with the story from me when I use it, and I'll say, actually, this is a former a Harris Gin bottle, and that, I mean, how valuable that is word of mouth.
That's the most valuable form of marketing to anyone.
Yeah, exactly. But this is such a small percentage of the business, isn't it? You know, producing these brilliant objet d'art. We're not talking about million case brands here or anything like that. And I think that's where the challenge really comes, is at the higher end. But ultimately, if every bottle I buy I could keep and use in some secondary capacity, then you know, happy days. But that would be a lot of bottles in this house. But that's not going to happen, I'm afraid.
Excellent. Well, that leads us on quite nicely to around premium spirits in particular. So if we look at sort of like a 30-year-old Scotch or an XO cognac, typically they sort of have a lovely bottle, it's adorned, it comes in a presentation box. I mean, do we think this is possible to actually make a product like that sustainable?
Well, I think it's a little bit like, you know, blind tastings versus side-by-side bottle tastings of premium wines in the past, you know, and there's things about that, you know, screw top bottle. There's a lot of research on screw top bottles for wine, and you guys will know about more than me. But I think quite often, if you pass someone something, there is applied value to it. I would love to believe that somewhere in the future we could be like, well, the duty on this is this, and the production cost on this is this. And actually, unless you're barrel aging, of course, it's a whole other thing. But for us, when I make gin, apart from economies of scale, if I make gin here, it costs the same as whoever makes it down the road, especially if you're using similar equipment and, you know, whatever else. And, you know, we are charging about the brand, aren't we? And so for that purpose, that's where the XO cognac bottle that weighs 2 kilos to pick up, it becomes a decanter, right? And that's the big thing for us. It's no longer a bottle, it's a decanter, like your Harris bottle with olive oil in it. But I don't think, and you'll know better, Joel, I suppose, for your speciality, premium whiskies. You know, would you receive a 700ml plastic pouch of or a can of you know, a whiskey that's been to space, or would you want that bottle every time? No, I don't know.
It's you know, it's a fascinating conversation, this, because your initial point about gin is really, really valid. And I was doing a piece of work recently for a brand that has aged spirits, and they were trying to differentiate. They were trying to look at what, without looking at age, how can they make their spirits defined within their range, and when the same sort of production level goes in. And one of the examples I used was Tanqueray and Tanqueray 10. You know, one is more expensive than the other, but they both probably, because we know how this industry works, they both probably cost the same to produce, really. One's in a slightly smaller still with whole citrus fruits that go in, etc., etc. But the base, you know, liquid really costs the same to make. But one's in a nice, big, tall, heavy-based decanter, let's call it, and the other one's in a more classic gin-style bottle. That immediately demarks a price difference between the two. So, you know, taking away the value of the liquid in the bottle itself and how much that costs to produce and everything else, the initial interaction with the consumer on the shelf comes from the size and shape and weight of the bottle. And just like Nolan was talking about, you know, understanding how that makes a product more premium. When it comes to something like Scotch, it's fascinating because I get sent a lot of samples. I've got a load to my left and a load to my right of small sample bottles, and sometimes you get super premium stuff that arrives, very expensive, £1,000 worth of whiskey in tiny, small, you know, just little sample bottles. And it's not until you see the package that it comes in. And sometimes we can become quite blasé to that. And I remember buying myself a whiskey with like a £200 bottle of whiskey that came in a big box. And my initial reaction is just to get rid of the secondary packaging, because for me, it's all about the liquid.
Yeah.
And I had a friend come round and I got this massive box out and I opened it up and they were bamboozled by, they were really in awe of this package. And sometimes I think we forget, because we're so focused on the quality of liquid sometimes in our business, that how beguiling the package can be to a lot of people, and how it is part of the purchase. And I think that's a really interesting element that we need to remember, that yes, sustainability is great in the production of the liquid. Sustainability is great when it comes to the glass manufacturing and the stopper and everything else. But the secondary packaging is actually a big part of why somebody might buy something or buy something for gifting or receive as a gift. And can we make that sustainable? Yes, we can as well. And there's a lot of work that goes into doing that. But let's not forget the wow factor of that end of cognac and that end of whiskey and that end of rum and that end of some tequilas. And I think it's hugely important to maintain that and keep that going, because it's a big part of our industry. It's just, we need to start layering in the conversation that started in production and is now in glass and closures. We need to start layering that into packaging as well.
The conversation with the whiskey industry is really quite complex on this matter of sustainability, because the whiskey offer is of itself quite complex. And the moment you start talking of 15, 18, 25, 50 and 60 year old single malts, then by dint, the heavier packaging follows into the design of specification and the bill of materials, certainly. And it's interesting, 15, 20 years ago, when let's say Big Whiskey Co was clamoring to get into China. China is a market that is heavily reliant on gifting. We were getting involved with projects where a single bottle, okay, maybe a gallon bottle of whiskey, was weighing in at an almighty 20 kilos. It came with its own sort of travel case that had the outer travel case that had a sort of wooden beech or oak presentation box, and it was like Russian dolls. You know, before you got to the bottle of whiskey, you had to unravel or reveal. It was the grand reveal. You had to go through several layers of outer packaging. Now, many brand managers would view that as perhaps excessive nowadays, and there are sustainable choices that we can make even for the 50, 60 year old single malts. But it's interesting, we still get a lot of demand for particularly metal top stoppers that are precious metal plated, gold plated, silver plated, hand engraved. So, you know, you look at the materials going in to support this pack, and you can go around the world on a milk float, just to finish off the stopper. So it's very interesting, but it's so much more complex with whiskey, because the whiskey industry has that challenge of sitting on the stock for such a long time. And then when it gets that stock to market, that liquid to market after 50 or 60 years, it's obviously got to sell it for a premium.
Jim, I heard a story about one bottle of Scotch, which was the bottle was manufactured in France or Italy. It was sent to China to have a stopper put on it and then wrapped, and then they had to send that bottle from China to Scotland, where it was then filled with Scotch, single malt Scotch, because it has to be filled in Scotland, put into a box and then sent back to its core consumer in China. And you just think, this is mind-boggling, you know, in terms of the air miles this bottle has done just to get round the houses and back out to the consumer again. And that was an off-the-record conversation, hence not saying who it was, but you know, that happens probably more often than we think it does. And that's the areas where brands need to embrace and say, is this acceptable any longer? You know, but that also needs to come from the consumer. It needs to come from the premium purchaser who's buying that and drinking that in a premium hotel bar it could be New York, it could be Shanghai, it could be Sydney, it could be wherever. But you know, we need to be asking these questions, and if we ask the questions as consumers, or consumers ask the questions, it will go back to the manufacturer, which is the key thing.
It is really interesting though, because as Jim says, I think it probably happens a lot more than you'd actually think. You know, unfortunately or fortunately, depends how you look at it. The super premium segment, at least within spirits, is not a segment that is perhaps suited to sustainability at the moment. And I think the thing that will change it is the consumer. You know, when you are trying to sell a bottle of, I don't know, a bottle of whiskey for anything over £1,000, you know, you need to be batting in a different arena. With that, though, you know, Jim's absolutely right. It's also a very complex industry with a lot of varied opinions on it. But with that, there are some, you know, there's some distilleries up in Scotland that are breaking the mold. So a really good example of that is Adelphi Distillery with the Ardent American. You know, their releases sell out in minutes. They're very sought after, and their packaging is very basic and very sustainable. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see if that tide turns. Now, most of their releases are still not over £1,000, but it'll be interesting to see, you know, if that starts becoming a bit of a trend. You know, there's other people out there that are very much on that ilk as well. Arbiki is another great example. You know, they are all about sustainability. So, you know, I do think it's there, but when you then get into that super premium segment, it becomes a lot more complicated because it's what the consumer expects if they are spending, you know, a king's ransom on a bottle of whiskey.
There's a really interesting initiative, Bruichladdich Distillery on the Isle of Isla. They're trying to go for B Corp status, so sort of the wash of sustainability across the whole thing. And they've just introduced a one tin less campaign, which means all of their bottles come with secondary packaging. But you can now, when you purchase direct from them, you can opt to not have the secondary packaging, which I think is a really nice. You know, it's just little changes like that give people the option to be sustainable. And I do think there's an element here of, you know, trying not to ram sustainability down people's throats as well, giving people options and saying, look, if you want this to be a little bit more efficient, we can make it more efficient for you. You don't have to have the secondary tin, but some people, if you're gifting, for example, you might like the secondary tin because that just completes the package a bit more. But if you're just going to drink it at home and throw the tin away anyway, why should we send it to you and you can opt out? And it's little initiatives like that I think are really clever, really sensible. And it's these micro steps forward that we've seen over the last decade that's got us to this conversation today. I mean, I don't think we could have been having this conversation a decade ago with quite as many examples. It would have just been about how can we plant more trees to offset our carbon footprint. And it's nice that we can have this debate.
I think Nolan mentioned two companies that have been quite progressive, as it were, Ardent American and Arbiki. They've had that honest conversation with their consumers. They haven't rammed it down their consumers' throats. They've just been honest with them, and they've said, look, these are the choices that we have made as a producer, and this is how we're going to go about sustainability and sustainability issues. So they've had the conversation, and therefore the responsibility rests with us as conscious consumers. We have a choice, don't we? We have a choice to go through door B, door A or door B. And I think that increasingly, if brands are open and if they have that conversation with their consumer, then the consumer can make the choice.
And Jim, I think one of the things that I really hope, one of my wishes for this industry is almost not to become like the fashion industry, where the fashion industry, you can choose to engage with sustainable fashion if you can afford it. And that's part of the problem. It's the if you can afford it bit. And what I'm hoping for the spirits industry is that it becomes sustainable across the board, whether you're buying a £13 bottle of gin in the supermarket or whether you're buying a £30,000 bottle of single malt scotch. And, you know, that for me is the big litmus test is let's hope this doesn't become a haves and have not conversation of people who can afford to be sustainable and people who sadly can't, to it being a core part of the DNA across all areas of the spirits business.
No, I'd agree.
Let's hope so.
I could literally talk about this for hours. I think there's so much information here around people making choices and what different people in different levels can do more of to actually make everything a bit better. But I think it's a lot about choices, the choices that we make and the choices that consumers make. As I said, I could talk about this for hours, and I think there'll be plenty of conversations like this as it grows and it continues, as we've sort of said over the last couple of years, this has come on leaps and bounds. So I'm expecting to have a lot more exciting conversations like this in the future. But thank you so much for all your time. It's been a really, really, really great panel. I think it's really interesting. So many interesting and great points, and lots of stuff to build on for the future as well. So Max, Nolan, Jim, Joel, thank you so much for all your time. It's been great chat. This has been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thanks, guys. Nice chat.
See ya.